The ground beneath Captain James Morrison's boots trembled as the first shells screamed overhead on the morning of May 30th, 1918. Standing at the eastern outskirts of Château-Thierry, he watched German artillery pulverize the small French town that lay between the Kaiser's advancing army and Paris, only 37 miles away. The Marne River wound through the heart of this strategic crossroads like a silver serpent, its three ancient stone bridges now serving as the last barrier between German victory and Allied salvation. Morrison commanded Company A of the 3rd Infantry Division's 7th Machine Gun Battalion, part of the freshly arrived American Expeditionary Force. His men, many barely 20 years old, had crossed the Atlantic with dreams of glory, but now faced the grinding reality of the Great War's most desperate hour. The German spring offensive had shattered Allied lines across the Western Front. In General Erich Ludendorff's stormtroopers were closer to Paris than they had been since 1914. Through his field glasses, Morrison observed the chaotic retreat of French colonial troops streaming across the bridges. Their faces bore the hollow-eyed exhaustion of men who had seen too much death. Their blue uniforms torn and muddied from weeks of constant withdrawal. Behind them, barely visible through the morning mist, came the Feldgrau tide of German infantry, their distinctive coal scuttle helmets bobbing like a deadly sea advancing toward the Marne. The strategic importance of Château-Thierry could not be overstated. This modest town of cobblestone streets and medieval buildings controlled the main crossing point over the Marne River, the natural defensive line that French commanders hoped might finally stem the German advance. If Ludendorff's forces could seize the bridges intact, nothing would prevent them from continuing their relentless march toward the French capital. General Philippe had made the desperate decision to commit American forces to the defense, despite their lack of combat experience. The 3rd Infantry Division, known as the Rock of the Marne, had arrived just days earlier. Their khaki uniforms still clean and their equipment untested by battle. Alongside them stood elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, including a brigade of United States Marines whose reputation for ferocity was already becoming legendary. According to a detailed account from the Army Heritage Center Foundation, the German Spring Offensive of 1918 was the last-ditch effort by the Central Powers to achieve victory before American reinforcements could tip the balance. The offensive had already consumed hundreds of thousands of casualties on both sides, leaving the German army stretched thin but still dangerous. The French 43rd Infantry Division, commanded by General Jean de Goutte, held the northern approaches to the town alongside their American allies. These veteran poilus had weathered for years of unprecedented carnage, from the Marne to Verdun, and their weathered faces reflected the accumulated horror of industrial warfare. They watched the approaching Americans with a mixture of hope and skepticism, wondering if these eager young soldiers possessed the steel necessary to halt the German juggernaut. As Morrison adjusted his position behind a hastily constructed machine gun nest, he could hear the distant sound of German voices carried on the morning breeze. The enemy was close now, perhaps no more than a few hundred yards beyond the town's northern edge. His men checked their weapons one final time, the metallic clicks of bolt actions and safety catches creating a deadly symphony that would soon crescendo into the thunderous roar of battle. The fate of Paris, perhaps of the entire war, now rested in the hands of these untested American soldiers and their French allies. Standing together on the banks of the Marne as the German storm approached, dawn broke gray and ominous on June 1st, 1918, as the German assault began in earnest. Captain Morrison's machine gunners crouched behind their steel-plated weapons as the first wave of German infantry emerged from the morning fog like gray phantoms. The distinctive crack of Mauser rifles echoed across the Marne Valley, answered immediately by the rapid chatter of American machine guns and the deeper bark of French Lebel rifles. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Malone, commanding the 23rd Infantry Regiment, had positioned his men in defensive positions throughout the town's northern districts. The Americans had spent the previous night digging hasty entrenchments and reinforcing stone buildings with sandbags, creating a patchwork of strong points designed to channel the German advance toward predetermined killing zones. The narrow streets of Château-Thierry, originally laid out in medieval times, now became a deadly maze where every corner could conceal an enemy machine gun nest. The German attack began with their characteristic precision. Stormtroopers from the 10th Reserve Division, veterans of the successful offensives at Chemin des Dames and Below Wood, advanced in small groups using cover and concealment tactics perfected over 4 years of trench warfare. These elite soldiers, armed with the latest model Guhar 98 rifles and deadly stick grenades, represented the cutting edge of German military innovation. Sergeant William Big Bill Henderson of the 7th Machine Gun Battalion watched through his weapon's iron sights as the first German squad approached his position near the town square. The enemy soldiers moved with the fluid grace of experienced killers, leapfrogging from cover to cover while their comrades provided suppressive fire. Henderson waited until they were within 50 yards before opening fire, his Browning machine gun spitting a stream of .30 caliber bullets that dropped 3 Germans in rapid succession. The initial German probing attacks quickly escalated into a full-scale assault as more enemy units committed to the battle. Mortar rounds began falling on American positions, sending clouds of masonry and debris cascading into the streets. The distinctive whistle of incoming artillery created a counterpoint to the staccato rhythm of small arms fire. While the acrid smell of cordite and burning wood filled the air, French colonial troops, initially positioned on the town's eastern approaches, began falling back under intense German pressure. These Senegalese soldiers, fighting far from their African homeland, had already endured weeks of continuous combat during the German offensive. Their tactical withdrawal threatened to expose the right flank of the American defensive line, forcing Captain Morrison to redeploy his machine guns to cover the widening gap. Private First Class Tommy O'Sullivan, a 19-year-old farm boy from Kansas, found himself separated from his squad during the confused fighting in the town's residential district. Armed only with his Springfield rifle and a handful of ammunition clips, he took shelter in a bombed-out bakery and began engaging German soldiers as they attempted to advance toward the main bridge. His accurate rifle fire accounted for at least 6 enemy casualties, before a German stick grenade forced him to abandon his position. The battle's intensity continued to escalate as both sides committed additional forces. German artillery observers, positioned on the high ground north of town, began calling in increasingly accurate fire missions on American strongpoints. The medieval church of St., which had stood for over 6 centuries, took a direct hit from a German howitzer shell, its ancient stones scattering like deadly confetti across the surrounding square. By mid-morning, the German advance had pushed deep into the town's northern districts. With enemy soldiers now fighting from building to building, the Americans found themselves engaged in brutal close-quarters combat, using bayonets, rifle butts, and even entrenching tools as weapons. The genteel rules of warfare gave way to primal survival instincts, as soldiers on both sides fought with desperate ferocity for control of strategic buildings and street intersections. Despite their inexperience, the American troops demonstrated remarkable tenacity under fire. Their months of intensive training in the United States and France had prepared them for the technical aspects of modern warfare. But nothing could have prepared them for the psychological shock of their first major battle. Yet they held their positions with a stubbornness that surprised even their veteran French allies. The fate of Château-Thierry now hung in the balance, as German forces pressed their assault toward the 3 crucial bridges spanning the Marne River. Major General Joseph Dickman, commanding the 3rd Infantry Division, had made the difficult decision to hold the northern bank at all costs, knowing that once the Germans secured the river crossings, nothing would prevent them from continuing their advance toward Paris. Captain Henry Boucher of the French Engineers Corps crouched beneath the main stone bridge with his demolition team, their hands steady on the detonator plungers despite the chaos raging above. The bridge, constructed in the 17th century during the reign of King Louis XIV, had witnessed countless armies cross its ancient stones, but none so critical to the fate of Western civilization as the gray-clad soldiers now approaching its northern approach. According to historical accounts, early the following morning, 1st June, the Germans advanced into Château-Thierry from the north, forcing the French to the main bridge, which they defended with the support of American machine gun fire. The coordination between French and American forces proved crucial. As enemies stormed, troopers pushed deeper into the town's defensive perimeter. Lieutenant Robert Bobby MacArthur, nephew of the future General Douglas MacArthur, led his platoon in a desperate fighting withdrawal through the town's winding streets. His Springfield rifle had claimed 7 German lives during the morning's fighting, but ammunition was running dangerously low. The young officer, barely 22 years old and a recent graduate of West Point, found himself making life-and-death decisions that would have challenged officers with decades of experience. The German assault reached its crescendo as elements of the 10th Reserve Division's 2nd Battalion launched a coordinated attack on the bridge approaches. These veteran soldiers, many of whom had survived the carnage at Verdun and the Somme, moved with the mechanical precision of men who had perfected the art of killing. Their gray uniforms, now stained with mud and blood, bore the distinctive insignia of the Prussian Guard, elite units that formed the backbone of the German army. Sergeant Major Klaus von Brenner, career soldier with 23 years of service to the fatherland, led the German spearhead toward the bridge. His scarred face told the story of 4 years of continuous warfare. From the initial advance through Belgium to the desperate battles of the Hindenburg Line, von Brenner carried a captured French Showcut automatic rifle, a weapon he had liberated during the successful offensive at Chaman-des-Dames, and he used it with deadly efficiency against the retreating Allied forces. The American machine gun crews positioned around the bridge plaza maintained their devastating fire despite mounting casualties. Private First Class Joseph Joey Kowalski, the son of Polish immigrants from Chicago, served as ammunition bearer for Sergeant Henderson's gun crew. Despite taking shrapnel in his left shoulder from a German hand grenade, Kowalski continued feeding ammunition belts into the red-hot machine gun barrel, his blood staining the brass cartridges as they disappeared into the weapons-hungry mechanism. French artillery batteries, positioned on the high ground south of the Marne, began firing over open sights at German forces massing near the bridge. The 75th mm model, 1905 guns, pride of the French Artillery Corps, sent their shells screaming across the river at nearly point-blank range. Each round created massive casualties among the tightly packed German assault troops. But still they came forward, driven by a combination of duty, desperation, and the knowledge that this might be their last chance for victory. The medieval buildings surrounding the bridge plaza began to crumble under the intense artillery bombardment. The Hôtel de Ville, seat of local government since the Renaissance, took multiple direct hits that reduced its elegant facade to rubble. Ancient limestone blocks, carved by craftsmen centuries dead, now served as improvised fortifications for soldiers fighting the most modern and deadly war in human history. Captain Morrison realized that his machine gun position near the bridge was becoming untenable. As German fire concentrated on his location, the enemy had identified his weapon as the primary obstacle to their advance. Mortar rounds were beginning to bracket his position with increasing accuracy. He made the difficult decision to withdraw his gun crew to a secondary position, while maintaining covering fire for the French engineers preparing to destroy the bridge. As the German assault troops reached within 20 yards of the bridge's northern approach, Captain Boucher received the signal from his commanding officer to execute the demolition. The French engineer captain took one last look at the ancient stonework that would soon be reduced to rubble, then pressed the detonator. The massive explosion that followed could be heard for miles, sending chunks of medieval masonry cascading into the Marne River like a stone waterfall. The destruction of the main bridge created a temporary respite in the German assault, but von Brenner's stormtroopers quickly adapted to the new situation. Using inflatable boats and improvised rafts, they began attempting river crossings both upstream and downstream from the destroyed span, forcing the American and French defenders to extend their perimeter along the riverbank. With the main bridge reduced to smoking rubble, the battle for Château-Thierry evolved into a desperate struggle for control of the remaining river crossings. The smaller stone bridge downstream and the railroad trestle upstream now became the focal points of German attention, while American and French forces struggled to contain multiple enemy breakthrough attempts along the Marne's northern bank. Colonel Edmund Butts, commanding the 30th Infantry Regiment, established his command post in the basement of the town's main church, its thick stone walls providing protection from increasingly accurate German artillery fire. The colonel, a veteran of the Indian Wars and the Spanish-American conflict, had never faced an enemy as skilled and determined as the German stormtroopers now threatening his defensive line. His weathered hands traced tactical movements on a mud-stained map, while runners carried orders through the chaos of urban combat above. Private Second Class Michael Mickey O'Brien, an Irish immigrant son from Boston, found himself defending a strategic intersection near the railroad bridge with nothing but his bayonet-fixed Springfield rifle and 2 remaining clips of ammunition. The young soldier, who had lied about his age to enlist at 17, now faced the ultimate test of courage as German soldiers advanced toward his position through the smoke-filled streets. His first shot dropped a German sergeant at 40 yards. His second wounded a stormtrooper attempting to flank his position. The German response to the bridge destruction was swift and professional. Major Friedrich von Steuben, commanding the assault battalion, immediately deployed his reserve companies to secure alternative crossing points, while his engineers began constructing pontoon bridges under heavy fire. Von Steuben, descendant of the Prussian officer who had trained George Washington's Continental Army, now found himself fighting against American soldiers who demonstrated many of the same qualities that had impressed his ancestor a century and a half earlier. Corporal James "Jimmy" Washington, one of the first African-American soldiers to serve in combat with a regular Army unit, manned a Lewis gun position overlooking the railroad trestle, despite facing discrimination within his own army. Washington fought with distinction alongside his white comrades, his accurate fire preventing multiple German crossing attempts. His weapon accounted for 12 confirmed enemy casualties before a German sniper's bullet shattered his left arm, forcing him to continue firing one-handed until reinforcements could reach his position. The intensity of combat reached its peak during the afternoon of June 1st, as German forces launched simultaneous attacks on both remaining river crossings. Stormtroopers armed with the new MP-18 submachine guns provided devastating close-range firepower. While German flamethrower teams attempted to clear American strongpoints with liquid fire, the acrid smell of burning fuel oil mixed with cordite and blood created an atmosphere that seemed lifted from the depths of hell. Captain Morrison's machine gun crews, now reduced to half strength due to casualties, continued their deadly work from positions throughout the town's defensive perimeter. Their water-cooled Browning guns fired over 10,000 rounds during the first day of fighting, the barrels glowing cherry red from continuous use. Ammunition runners risked their lives crossing fire-swept streets to keep the weapons supplied with the brass-cased cartridges that formed the backbone of American defensive fire. Lieutenant MacArthur's platoon, now down to 15 men from its original strength of 42, occupied a fortified position in the town's railway station. The young officer had proven himself a natural leader under fire, organizing successful counterattacks against German penetrations while maintaining contact with adjacent units through field telephone lines that were constantly severed by artillery fire. His men, initially skeptical of their college-educated lieutenant, now followed him with the unquestioning loyalty reserved for leaders who shared their dangers. The German assault on the railroad trestle reached its climax when stormtroopers managed to establish a small bridgehead on the southern bank of the Marne. Major von Steuben personally led the crossing attempt, wading through waist-deep water while machine gun bullets whipped the surface around him like deadly rain. His successful establishment of a foothold on the Allied side of the river threatened to unravel the entire American defensive position. Sergeant Henderson, despite suffering wounds from German grenade fragments, organized an immediate counterattack to eliminate the enemy bridgehead, leading a mixed force of American infantry and French colonial troops. The veteran non-commissioned officer assaulted the German position with bayonets fixed and battle cries echoing across the water. The hand-to-hand combat that followed was brutal and decisive, with quarter neither asked nor given by either side. The day's fighting exacted a terrible toll on both armies. American casualties mounted steadily as inexperienced soldiers learned the harsh lessons of modern warfare through blood and sacrifice. German losses were equally severe, with elite stormtrooper units suffering devastating casualties in their attempts to force the river crossings. The Marne ran red with the blood of young men from two continents who died fighting for causes they barely understood but believed in completely. As darkness fell over the shattered town of Château-Thierry, both sides consolidated their positions and prepared for the next day's fighting. The initial German assault had been contained, but at enormous cost to the defenders. The second day of battle dawned with an ominous silence that veteran soldiers recognized as the calm before a storm. Captain Morrison, his uniform torn and stained with the blood of wounded comrades, surveyed the defensive positions his machine gun crews had held throughout the night. German artillery had maintained a steady, harassing fire during the hours of darkness, but the expected night assault had never materialized. Now, as pale morning light illuminated the smoke-shrouded battlefield, Morrison could see why the enemy had paused their attack. Reinforcements were arriving on both sides of the conflict. German artillery batteries, including massive siege howitzers normally used for fortress warfare, had been brought up during the night and now targeted the American defensive positions with devastating accuracy. The 8-inch shells created enormous craters in the town square and reduced entire buildings to rubble with single direct hits. The psychological effect on the American troops, many of whom had never experienced such concentrated firepower, was almost as devastating as the physical destruction. However, American reinforcements were also moving into position. Elements of the 2nd Infantry Division, including the 5th and 6th Marine Regiments, completed their forced march from reserve positions and were now taking up defensive positions along the Marne's southern bank. These Marines, who would soon earn immortal fame at nearby Below, would brought with them a reputation for aggressive fighting that would prove crucial in the coming battle. Colonel James Harbord, commanding the Marine Brigade, established his headquarters alongside Colonel Boots's position, creating a unified command structure that would coordinate the defense of the entire Château-Thierry sector. Harbord, a career military officer with extensive experience in the Philippines, brought professional competence and calm leadership to a situation that was rapidly spinning out of control. His Marines, distinguished by their forest green uniforms and swagger, immediately began improving the defensive positions with the methodical efficiency that would become their trademark. The German assault resumed at precisely 800 hours on June 2nd, with an artillery barrage that exceeded anything previously experienced on the Western Front. Over 200 guns, ranging from light field pieces to massive railway-mounted siege cannons, concentrated their fire on the American positions for 2 solid hours. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard in Paris, 37 miles away, where French civilians gathered in the streets to listen to the distant thunder of their fate being decided. Private O'Brien, now promoted to corporal after his squad leader's death in the previous day's fighting, led his remaining men in occupying a crater-torn intersection that had become known as Death Corner among the American troops. The young soldier, his boyish face now aged beyond his years by 36 hours of continuous combat, positioned his Springfield rifle to cover the most likely German approach routes while trying to ignore the bodies of his fallen comrades scattered throughout the rubble. When the German infantry assault began, it came with a violence that exceeded even the previous day's fighting. Stormtroopers from 3 different divisions, supported by teams of flamethrower specialists and armed with the latest weapons technology, advanced through the shattered streets like a gray tide of destruction. Their objective was no longer simply to cross the Marne River, but to annihilate the American forces that had dared to stand in their path. Major von Steuben, his left arm in an improvised sling from wounds received in the previous day's fighting, personally led the assault on the American positions near the destroyed main bridge. The German officer had received word that Crown Prince Ruprecht himself was monitoring the battle's progress, adding personal pressure to the military necessity of victory. Von Steuben's stormtroopers moved through the ruins with practiced efficiency, using grenades and submachine gun fire to clear American strongpoints one by one. The arrival of the Marines proved decisive in stemming the German advance. Gunnery Sergeant Daniel Daly, a veteran of conflicts in China and Haiti, organized a counterattack that drove German forces back from their furthest penetration into the town. Daly's Marines, fighting with the aggressive tactics that would soon make them legends, engaged the enemy in close-quarters combat with bayonets, trench knives, and whatever weapons came to hand. The German advance stalled, and then began to retreat under the fury of the Marine assault. Captain Morrison's machine gun crews, now reinforced with Marine weapons teams, established interlocking fields of fire that turned the town's main streets into killing zones. The water-cooled Browning guns, fed by seemingly endless belts of ammunition carried forward by volunteer runners, maintained a rate of fire that broke up every German assault attempt. The mechanical precision of American industrial production was now being applied to the ancient art of warfare with devastating effect. Artillery played an increasingly important role as both sides brought more guns into action. American artillery officers working closely with forward observers, positioned in the town's remaining tall buildings, began to master the complex art of firing danger-close missions in support of their infantry. The 75th millimeter guns, manned by crews that included recent graduates of American artillery schools, demonstrated remarkable accuracy in suppressing German strongpoints while avoiding friendly casualties. The German response was swift and professional. But their artillery observers found themselves increasingly targeted by American snipers and counter-battery fire. The 3rd day of battle at Château-Thierry began with a pre-dawn German infiltration attempt that nearly succeeded in capturing the American command post. Stormtroopers, their faces blackened with coal dust and moving with the silent precision of experienced night fighters, penetrated deep into the town's defensive perimeter before being detected by alert sentries. The resulting firefight in the narrow streets and bombed-out buildings created a chaos of muzzle flashes, screaming wounded, and the distinctive crack of rifle fire echoing off stone walls. Sergeant Major Thomas "Top" Kelly, senior non-commissioned officer of the 30th Infantry Regiment, found himself fighting for his life in the basement of a destroyed pharmacy. The veteran soldier who had enlisted during the Spanish-American War and served in the Philippines now faced German soldiers armed with the latest weapons technology in hand-to-hand combat among the scattered medical supplies. Kelly's trench knife, a wicked blade designed specifically for close-quarters fighting, claimed 3 German lives before the enemy infiltrators were finally eliminated. The dawn revealed the true extent of the devastation that 3 days of intensive combat had inflicted on the medieval town. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now reduced to skeletal frameworks of broken stone and twisted metal. The Gothic cathedral, which had sheltered the faithful since the 13th century, bore the scars of artillery strikes and machine gun fire. Ancient gargoyles carved by medieval stonemasons to ward off evil spirits now stared down at a scene that exceeded their creator's darkest nightmares. Colonel Harbord's Marines had proven their worth during the night fighting, but the cost was becoming apparent in the pale morning light. Marine casualties were mounting steadily as German resistance stiffened, and their artillery became more accurate. Each street corner fought for, and each building cleared came at the price of young lives that would never see home again. The forest green uniforms that had arrived crisp and clean just days earlier were now torn, bloodied, and caked with the dust of pulverized masonry. Captain Morrison, now commanding what remained of 3 different machine gun companies after heavy officer casualties, positioned his weapons to cover the approaches to the secondary bridge. His guns had fired over 50,000 rounds during the battle, their barrels worn smooth by the constant friction of bullets and their water-cooling jackets pierced by German counterfire. The captain himself bore the scars of close combat, including a German bayonet wound in his left shoulder and shrapnel cuts across his face from a near-miss artillery strike. The German high command, growing increasingly desperate as their offensive stalled, committed additional reserves to the Château-Thierry attack. The Prussian Guard Division, elite troops normally held in reserve for critical situations, received orders to break through the American positions at any cost. These soldiers, many of whom were sons of Prussian nobility, represented the finest military tradition of the German Empire. Their gray uniforms bore the distinctive insignia of units that had fought with distinction from Königgrätz to Tannenberg. Lieutenant MacArthur, now commanding the remnants of 2 companies after his captain's death in a German mortar attack, established a new defensive line in the town's central market square. The young officer had demonstrated remarkable leadership under fire, earning the respect of veteran non-commissioned officers who had initially doubted his competence. His tactical decisions, made under extreme pressure, showed a natural military instinct that would later serve him well in future conflicts. The arrival of American artillery reinforcements marked a turning point in the battle's dynamics. The 1st Field Artillery Regiment, equipped with French-manufactured 75mm guns and trained by experienced French instructors, began counter-battery missions against German gun positions. The mathematical precision required for effective artillery fire, combined with the industrial efficiency of American ammunition production, created a deadly combination that began to neutralize German fire superiority. Private O'Brien, now leading a squad of Marines and soldiers after being temporarily promoted to sergeant, occupied a forward observation post in the cathedral's damaged bell tower. From this elevated position, could direct artillery fire onto German assault formations, while maintaining communication with friendly units through a field telephone line that had been repaired countless times during the fighting. His accurate fire direction accounted for the destruction of at least 2 German machine gun nests and a mortar position. The German assault on the secondary bridge reached its climax when Major von Steuben led his remaining stormtroopers in a desperate charge across the narrow span. The German officer, his uniform now bearing the accumulated damage of 3 days' fighting, personally carried the first explosive charges toward the American defensive positions on the southern bank. His courage was matched by that of his men, who followed him into the teeth of concentrated machine gun fire with the fatalistic bravery of soldiers who knew their cause was probably lost. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed on the bridge exceeded anything previously experienced in the battle. American Marines and soldiers fought German stormtroopers with bayonets, rifle butts, trench knives, and whatever weapons came to hand. The ancient stones, which had witnessed countless peaceful crossings over the centuries, now ran red with the blood of young men fighting for causes that transcended their individual lives. The dead from both sides fell into the Marne River, their bodies carried downstream by currents that had remained unchanged since Roman times. Captain Morrison's machine guns, firing from carefully prepared positions, broke up the German assault with devastating effect. The interlocking fields of fire that his crews had established turned the bridge approaches into a killing ground where courage could not overcome. Superior firepower and tactical positioning, the fourth and final day of the Battle of Château-Thierry began with an eerie quiet that seemed to press against the eardrums of exhausted soldiers on both sides of the Marne. Captain Morrison, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep in his uniform bearing the accumulated grime of 4 days' continuous fighting, surveyed his remaining machine gun positions as pale dawn. Light filtered through the smoke that perpetually shrouded the shattered town. His original complement of 60 men had been reduced to fewer than 20 effective fighters, but these survivors had been forged into a weapon of remarkable lethality. The German High Command, faced with mounting casualties and the complete failure of their offensive objectives, made the difficult decision to begin a fighting withdrawal from the Château-Thierry sector. Major von Steuben, his once pristine uniform now torn and bloodstained, received orders that evening to conduct a strategic retrograde movement that would preserve his remaining forces for future operations. The German officer, who had led his men with distinction throughout the battle, now faced the bitter task of abandoning ground that had cost so many lives to contest. Allied intelligence officers, monitoring German radio communications and interrogating captured prisoners, began to detect signs of the enemy withdrawal during the pre-dawn hours of June 4th. Colonel Harbord, coordinating the American response from his command post in the cathedral basement, ordered reconnaissance patrols to probe German positions and confirm the suspected enemy movement. These small groups of volunteers, armed with Springfield rifles and carrying signal flares, crept through the rubble-strewn streets to gather intelligence on German intentions. The first confirmation of German withdrawal came from Sergeant Henderson's machine gun crew, positioned to overlook the northern approaches to the town. The veteran non-commissioned officer, his weapon now firing from its fourth different position after the previous 3 had been destroyed by enemy fire, reported that German soldiers were moving equipment and wounded personnel away from their forward positions under cover of darkness. This information, quickly relayed to higher command, triggered a series of patrol actions designed to maintain contact with the retreating enemy. Private First Class O'Sullivan, Kansas farm boy who had distinguished himself throughout the fighting, volunteered for a dangerous reconnaissance mission into the German-held portions of the town, armed with only a Springfield rifle and a handful of ammunition clips. The young soldier made his way through buildings reduced to skeletal ruins by artillery fire. His careful observation confirmed that major German units were indeed conducting an organized withdrawal, leaving behind only small rearguard detachments to cover their movement. The American response was swift but cautious. Colonel Butz, commanding the 30th Infantry Regiment, organized a series of limited attacks designed to pressure the German rearguards without risking the heavy casualties that would result from a premature assault. These probing actions, conducted by small teams of experienced soldiers and Marines, gradually expanded American control throughout the contested areas of the town, while maintaining pressure on the withdrawing enemy forces. Captain Morrison's machine gunners played a crucial role in supporting these advance operations, providing covering fire for infantry patrols while preventing German counterattacks against newly occupied positions. The water-cooled Browning guns, their barrels worn smooth by days of continuous firing, continued their deadly work with mechanical precision. Ammunition, supplied by volunteer runners who risked their lives crossing fire-swept streets, kept the weapons in constant action against targets of opportunity. Lieutenant MacArthur, now commanding a composite force of Marines and infantry soldiers, led one of the most successful advance operations of the day. His mixed unit, moving through the destroyed residential district near the railway station, countered a German rearguard position occupied by stormtroopers from the 10th Reserve Division. The ensuing firefight, conducted among the ruins of houses that had sheltered French families for generations, resulted in the capture of 12 German prisoners and a significant quantity of military equipment. The German withdrawal, while professionally executed, could not disguise the strategic failure that the Battle of Château-Thierry represented for the Central Powers. General Ludendorff's spring offensive, which had begun with such promise months earlier, had finally been stopped by the combined resistance of French and American forces. The dream of reaching Paris before American reinforcements could arrive in decisive numbers was now permanently shattered. By noon on June 4th, American patrols had occupied the northern outskirts of Château-Thierry, effectively ending German control of any portion of the town. The stars and stripes, raised over the damaged city hall by Marines from the 2nd Division, fluttered in the smoke-filled breeze as a symbol of Allied victory. French civilians emerging from cellars and basements where they had sheltered during the fighting greeted their American liberators with tears of joy and what little food they could spare. The casualties from 4 days of intensive fighting were sobering for both sides. During the battle, the Americans and French suffered a combined 1,900 casualties, while the Germans endured over 5,300. These numbers, while representing a tactical victory for the Allies, came at a terrible human cost that would haunt survivors for the remainder of their lives. The Battle of Château-Thierry marked a turning point not only in the German spring offensive, but in the entire character of World War I. American forces had proven themselves capable of standing against the finest troops the German Empire could deploy, while their industrial capacity promised unlimited reinforcements for future operations. The psychological impact of this first major American victory resonated throughout both the Allied and Central Powers command structures, signaling that the balance of the war had shifted decisively. Captain Morrison, surveying the battlefield from his final machine gun position, reflected on the transformation his men had undergone during 4 days of hell. They had arrived as eager volunteers with romantic notions of warfare. They departed as hardened veterans who understood the true cost of victory. The lessons learned in the streets of Château-Thierry would serve them well in future battles, but nothing could restore the innocence that had been lost along the banks of the Marne River. The medieval town of Château-Thierry, witness to so much history over the centuries, would be rebuilt in the years following the war. However, the memory of those 4 days in June 1918, when young Americans first proved their mettle against the armies of the Kaiser, would endure as long as free nations remember the price of liberty.